Hello there and welcome to the Gemhawks YouTube channel. I hope you're having a beautiful day. For today's tutorial, I'd like to share with you my earring display bar. Now, it's kind of fiddly to set up on the board, so let's head down there and take a look at it before I move it and spoil how beautiful it looks. So this is an example of the earring display bar. This piece has space for 7 pairs of earrings, and I'm going to demonstrate one with 6 today, but it's a really flexible design. You can have as many or as few as you like. What I'm going to do now is just to flash up a quick photograph of how I hang this in my workspace from one of my work trays, just to give you an idea of how it can be used other than just putting it flat on the board like so. So this is what the earring display bar looks like without any earrings on it. And these upper spirals are the ones that you can kind of use to hang. And in my demonstration piece for the upper of the 3 wires involved, I used a slightly heavier wire. So that's 1.25 or 16 gauge. Today I'm going to be making in 1mm or 18 gauge wire because my wrists are a bit sore because it's all rainy and horrible. So this piece, as I mentioned earlier, has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pairs of hanging loops. The piece I'm going to make today will have 6, but because you're making it yourself, you can put as many on there as you like. So let's just pop that down at the top of the board and grab our first piece of wire. Now, I will always suggest starting with quite a long piece of wire so you can see how it goes as to how many loops you want on your piece. This particular piece of wire is 15 inches in length, so this is going to make quite a long earring display bar, and I might just trim it off if I feel like I've done enough of the little loops just to make these pieces for the earring wires to go through. So I'm going to smooth through my length of wire, and again this is 1mm or 18 gauge, and I have around about 15 inches here to start working with. And we're going to start creating our pairs of loops, probably about 2 inches or at least 1.5 inches from one end. And today I'm going to use my memory wire finishing pliers purely because you get really nice, neat, repeatable loops. You can of course use your memory wire finishing tools. You can use your round nose pliers, or you could use your multi-step bail making pliers. So what we're going to do is, as I say, start a little way in from the end, and we're just going to use them to rotate that wire around until we get a loop on top of the wire. So if I remove that from the loop we've just made, what we're looking to have is a little bubble-like loop on the top of this straight line. So we're going to do another one so that we've got a pair of them. And when you don't have a camera above you, you can kind of move your pliers however you want them to go. So it's absolutely up to you, whichever way you want to do. You can move the pliers more, you can move the wire more. It doesn't really matter. Now, the one thing I want to show you is I've made these really wonky on purpose because it's really easy to make wonky loops. And in order to fix that, it's quite simple. So I'm going to come in with my little bent chain nose pliers, just pop them through the base of the loop and give it a very little squish. I'm going to flip that one over so it's nice and flat. And I'm just going to give, again, a little squish inside that loop. And you'll see that they instantly look a little bit better. So I'm going to give that central piece a nice little gentle squish as well. And you'll find that we have then a really nice straight line to work with. It doesn't really matter if there are some deviations between them, but you want the baseline, this long section of wire, to be nice and neat and tidy. So you can make all of your loops rotating in the same direction if you want to. What I've done is a loop in one direction and a loop in the other direction. What this will enable to happen is for the whole thing to be significantly flatter. So you've got 2 choices, and I'll show you what it looks like if you do all the loops in the same direction. And what I mean by that is the wire comes along, twists around over the top of the preceding piece of wire, and then continues on its merry way. And the way to correct that, if that's the way you choose to do it, is just to gently shift those loops so that they sit slightly on the diagonal, but you then end up with a flatter project. So let's put that back out of the way. I'll do just 2 more, and then I will go off camera and add my 6 loops into position. So what I tend to do is put 2 ear wire loops quite close together and then leave a larger gap before I start doing another loop. So let's bring that all the way around. So there's loop number 1. In an ideal world, we're looking to have the same distance between each paired loop, and then the same distance again between the pairs. So let's rotate this one around again, and I'm going to take that one over the top so that we have a pair that are in opposite directions. Now, if you find that your loops are far too close together or too far apart, what you can do is pop that pin back in, rotate them closer together, hold the loop, and then flatten that line back up. Now, you might get a little bit of a deviation just here, but you can soon flatten that down. Using a very similar technique, just pop those very fine tipped pliers in to get a straighter line. And you'll find with just a little bit of an effort, you can get quite a neat job. Another thing that you'll need to do as you go through making these pairs of loops is just make sure that all the loops are going to sit in the same direction. So when you pop it down on the board, you do want them to be relatively flat and on the same orientation as the board. So I'm going to whiz through this and make 6 pairs of loops rather, for 6 pairs of earrings. So I've continued making those little pairs of loops. It's not much of a difference in the space between the pairs of loops and between each loop in the pair, but it's a little bit extra just so that I can see where I need to hang those pairs of earrings. I'll show you now how to refine those loops just to make sure that they sit correctly, and then we'll move on to the next step. So the first thing I've done with my section of loopy wire is to trim both of these ends to be the same length. That's actually quite important because it means that your spirals will end up pretty much the same kind of size. So I've got around about 1.8 inches. I don't know what that is in metric. Let me grab a ruler. So it's about 48 millimeters just from the last loop to the end of the wire, and that's going to be around about the size I want for the looped section. You can make it slightly bigger if you want larger loops, or slightly smaller if you want teeny tiny ones. So that's absolutely up to you. Now, to refine those loops, what we're going to do is, as I showed you at the beginning, just make sure that the crossover section at the base of each loop is nice and flat, so you get that lovely straight flat line. So I've done that pretty much all the way along. I think I missed that last one. Give that a bit of a squish. And then make sure that each section between the pairs of loops and between each loop is nice and smooth. Now this one's just a little bit higher than I'd like, so I'm just going to give that a very tentative, gentle manoeuvre. And if I look down from above, you can see that all my loops are in the same direction now. So what I'm going to do is just to twist them very, very slightly, so that they sit a little more flat to that bar. So what I'm doing, if I show you from above, is just a little bit of a gentle twist to the side. So if I show you this quite closely, you can see that the loop begins closer to the left side and ends closer to the right side, and I'm just very softly slightly correcting that, not completely, just a little bit. And as we're doing that, what we're doing is also work hardening that loop, so they'll be nice and strong. You can do the whole project in a heavier wire if you wanted to, but for me today I'm going to use that 1mm or 18 gauge wire. Consistency of distance between each loop and each pair of loops is really, really helpful if you're looking to make these to sell. And just making sure that everything is nice and flat. Now another thing you can do is just run that through, pop it against a straight edge or a ruler and make sure that you're happy with how straight it is. The next thing we're going to do is add in another 2 pieces of wire, and they need to be now the same length as your looped section, which is why I don't suggest cutting them until we're ready. So I'm working from a spool of wire just here. I'm just going to make that ever so slightly longer to begin with. Give that a flush cut, trim away the end, and as I mentioned earlier on, if you want the top layer to have heavier weight wire, now is the time to add in the same length but 1 more strand of wire in that 1.25 or 16 gauge. I'm working entirely in 1mm today. So let's just give that a little bit of a trim. If they're a couple of mil out, it doesn't really matter. We can work on fixing that a little bit later on. Now, as always, we're going to need these pieces of wire to be nice and smooth and straight. This has come straight off the reel. So that's a little bit on the wonky side. So let's just run that between thumb and forefinger 1 or 2 times. I've had a question recently about how you can achieve this if you have a weakness in your wrists. I'm not pressing very hard. I am clamping at this end reasonably sturdily just to stop the wire from slipping out of the pliers. But the actual pressure to warm and smooth that wire through, especially if you're working with a gorgeous raw copper like I am, is fairly minimal. So let's give that second piece of wire a nice smooth through as well. Always good when a little lovely error happens. I'm going to leave that in because it's funny. So there we go. What happened was my hand lost grip on this side, and that's the good hand. So that tells you how my wrists are today. So let's just line these up for a second. What we're going to do now is a weave. Now you can really do whatever weave you fancy. I don't know if you can see that. That's a little bit of a zigzag, like a sumac weave. And that's something that I'm going to be teaching as a ring in a couple of weeks. But the weave I've chosen for this one is 5 around the middle piece of wire and then 2 around all 3 pieces of wire. Now this is a weave that has an upside, as you can see here, and then on the rear the weave looks different because you only go part of the way on 2 of those passes of wire and a single strand of wire up the middle, which encompasses all 3. And that's the nature of a lot of weaves. I do have a little introduction to wire weaving, which I'll put a link up to in the corner for you there. If you've never woven before, just give you a couple of ideas on different ways that you can create patterns. So that's the pattern I'm going to recreate today. So let me find my slightly lighter gauge wire. I'm going to use 26 gauge or 0.4mm wire for this. Now we always start with a little bit extra than I think I'm going to need. And what we will do is pick up our middle wire. So this is only relevant if you've got a heavy wire at the top. If they're both the same, it doesn't really matter. And what we're going to do is we're going to start just about here so that we're outside that first loop. I'm just going to lay a little bit over the top and then I will rotate that wire 5 times around that central heavy wire. So that's, I think, 4 and then 1 more going over the top. What we need to do is to bring that finer gauge wire tail down underneath. And what we shall do now is add the top wire into position. Just get that to sit for a second and then add the lowest wire with the loops. And we're going to start just to the side of those loops towards the cut end. So just ignore this tail that's attached to the reel for now. We're going to start learning the weave, which is, I promise, super easy. So 5 wraps around the central wire, and then we're going to do 2 wraps around all 3. And I'm just going to draw that underneath for a second. What you can do to make your life slightly easier is just very softly, if you put some warmth into that wire first, it will help you later. Just turn up the uppermost wire and turn down the lowermost wire. This is always super helpful when you're weaving because it gives you an opportunity to be able to see what is going where. So I'm going to grab hold of the tail of the wire and bring it up between the lowest and the middle wire. And then what we need to do is just wrap 5 times around only the middle wire. So around the middle one once, and if you're struggling to keep your heavier gauge wires straight, just slow down. Do 1 little wrap at a time. Let's bring that wire up again. You can leave yourself a little bit more wire than I chose to today. I'm being thrifty because I'm almost out of the fine stuff and I need to do a reorder. So up and over just the middle one. Pop that down above the middle one. And we're going to finish off with 5 wraps on this one, which, as I mentioned, my wrists are a little bit naughty today, so I'm not actually doing terribly well showing you. So all the way around, that's 3 wraps, up between the lowest and the middle wire 1 more time, over the top and then down between the middle and upper. That's 4 wraps, and then bring that wire up again, so that we're just wrapping solely around that middle wire. So once you've got your 5 wraps in position, we're going to flip to the underside. Just be careful you don't negatively impact this finer gauge wire coming away like this, because you don't want to put a kink in it. We want to use that. So I'm going to trim the tail as close as I possibly can to the point where it will then snuggle away as close to that weave as possible. So I'm just going to turn that, give it a little gentle squish, make sure nothing's crossing over here. Flip that back to the front side and just scooch it up. Just scooch it up gently so that it sits in position. Once you're happy that you've got 5 neat wraps, 2 neat wraps around all 3 wires and then 5 neat wraps around the middle wire, give that a very soft little squish, and we're not being harsh at all with this. We want it to be set in position, but we don't want to crush it so that it is going to be negatively impacted. Now, in order to weave this weave, you may need to move the loops slightly. I'm going to just tip this up towards the camera and show you how to open that up. So the tail of wire that's coming down towards my thumbnail is on top, and the tail of wire that's going away to the top of the screen is underneath. So what I'm going to do is just gently open that out. Don't worry that the looped section is sticking away at a funny angle, because what we need to do is flip the whole thing over so that the loops are now facing upwards. Now we've got that in position, we need to ensure that we bring the tail round. So I think that's too many weaves actually. Let me just bring that back one. That's better. So I've got 5 wraps around that middle wire. Let's make sure that's completely in the light. And I've taken the tail underneath so that when I now wrap twice around all 3 wires, can you see how that snuggles inside the looped section? I'm going to bring another wrap around all 3 wires, scooch that up so it's nice and neat, and then we're going to draw the wire that's nearest to me, which would be your thicker wire if you were using it, away slightly so I can gain access. And I'm just drawing that up between those 2 wires so that we can then wrap 5 times around that central wire. So I'm just going to do that very quickly, because all you will do is repeat, repeat, repeat until you end up at the far end of your design. So that's 3 wraps, 4 wraps, let's tip that up into the light, and a 5th wrap, taking the wire underneath the design. Scooch that up neatly. Now, before I go any further and start compressing this section of weaving, I need to close this loop back up. So again, you can see that the top side is closer to the left, the lower side is closer to the right. So I'm just going to give that I'm supporting underneath and then a gentle twist away to set that back to flat, and then very softly over the top, a very, very gentle squeeze, and then that is all set, ready for you to continue along. So always bring your finer gauge wire to the underside of your weaving pattern, and then we're going to do 2 wraps around all 3 wires, bring the finer gauge wire to the underneath, 2 wraps around all 3 again, 5 wraps, 2 wraps, etc, etc. So do that all the way along until you finish with a single wrap of 2 wires around all 3 and then 5 wraps around the middle. So you're reflecting the start at the finish, and I'll meet you there in a second. So in true Blue Peter fashion, here is one I prepared earlier. However, I've just noticed that I did a 3 wrap on this one around all 3 wires instead of a 2 wrap around all 3 wires, so it's going to look slightly different. The concept is exactly the same, and as I mentioned at the beginning of the video, you can 100% vary what weave you like. You can completely go for that zigzag one, or you can go for something that's stepped, one that looks like a New York skyline, whatever makes you happy. The concept is the same, just make sure that when you pick it up, if you have to put it down for whatever reason, you're weaving on the same face so that you can repeat that pattern. As I mentioned, this one looks different on the back. So let's head down to the board and we'll take a closer look at how to complete the design. As I mentioned, slightly different. I've got 3 wraps instead of 2 wraps, but it's one that I prepared earlier. So for me, the way I have hung my earring display bar up in my office, and I've already shown you a photograph of that, I might pop it on the outro photo as well today so you can see it in use, is to have a little bit of a curve as well. Now you don't have to hang it up, you can obviously just use this to control earrings on your board if that's what you want to do. So this was made a couple of days ago. I'm just going to put a little bit of water warmth into the woven section, and very definitely at either end of the design, making sure that you don't pull on the little single woven section at each end. So we're going to use a little bit of the forefinger just to create a nice curve in the design. As I mentioned, you don't have to have a curve in it, but I like it when there is one. I think it looks really attractive. Now, my initial display piece holds 7 pairs of earrings. This one holds 6. I think probably I would like to go for an odd number, because then you have a central pair of earrings that are at the lowest point of the bar, but you can play with the design however you want to. So once you've got a nice bit of curvature, what we're going to do is start by adding some swirls and flourishes. And as you can see from this initial one, heavier wire at the top, and I've brought those coils very, very close to the beginning of the weaving. If you wanted to, you could bring these swirls over the top, so you only have one swirl at the top and one at the bottom. You can completely do exactly as you desire. But I'm just going to show you how I created this piece. So again, I'm actually going to use my memory wire finishing pliers for this job, and I'm very, very softly opening these pieces of wire separately from one another. Again, a bit of warmth goes a long way, and we're going to start with a round form in the middle. You could use your multi-step bail makers or standard round nose pliers. And I'm just going to get a nice round form which isn't completely closed up. And the reason I do that is because when I close it up, you get a nice central aperture that is good and round. If you try to make the round form completely on the pliers and bring it back to this strand of wire that comes away from where you're starting, what can often happen is you get a slightly more oval piece. You can fix that just by softly closing it up like so. And then we're going to complete that form. Now, I custom made a little bar of wire to hold this in position on my tray. And all it is a straight length and then a hook that comes down and into the top of my spirals. So everything that I do on one side, I immediately do on the other side, but that looks boring. So let's just add another spiral. Now, another thing that you can do to change this design up and to be super useful if you want to, I was lazy there and I didn't take my pliers out soon enough, whoopsie. You could go for your pairs of loops all the way along and then finish with a single loop, and you could then make this last little spiral on the end into the second loop for your earrings. For instance, if I had made a pair just here, but I hadn't created this last loop, what I could then do is completely wind this loop up to the last loop on the lower wire. So you've got options again, as I say. I'm just going to bring that over slightly and then give it a squish. Now, it's really important to give those spirals a squish so that they stand up to being used. And this one on the end, you could trim away, or I think what I'm going to do today is to bring it down over the top of the lower loop, so it's a slightly cleaner look. I do like spirals in my work. It can just be a really nice way of closing up your designs and making sure that there's no jagged ends to catch on. I did flush cut everything. Let's bring that down and see what it looks like. So you could sit it centrally. You could put an angle in the wire here, slightly upwards, and make that one sit directly. In fact, that's what I'll do. So at the end of that little woven section, just here, I'm going to angle the wire up and away. And then I'm going to continue spiraling until that last spiral sits centrally in that little cluster. So it looks a little bit like a 3-leaf clover maybe, or I don't know, I'm not very good at flowers and plants. Give that all a squish and then repeat at the other end, and you've completed your earring display bar. Here's today's project. I hope that you've enjoyed making the earring display bar with me. If you are enjoying the content, please don't forget to drop a like on the video, add comments for things you want to see in the future, and do subscribe to the channel as it helps me be seen by the wider community. Around about 60% of my viewers are not subscribed, so it doesn't cost you anything to subscribe, and I only upload once a week. I promise not to get you too many interruptions in your day. There's today's earring bar. Let's have a lovely week ahead, and I'll see you soon. Bye for now.